Thank you very much, Gail. And the Frist Center, on behalf of the Frist Center, I'd like to thank Gail Carr-Williams and Chandra Allison for all of the amazing work that they do to make the Food for Thought series possible. And we also thank the Office of Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations at Vanderbilt University for sponsoring this series. Welcome to the Frist Center. I hope you all have had a chance to see the exhibition, but if you haven't, I'm going to give a short overview, just introducing you to some of the stars of the exhibition and some major themes in it. So Ink, Silk, and Gold, Islamic Art in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, it has 94 works of art from across the Islamic world, so that's from Spain to Indonesia, and from the 8th century to today. It's intended as an introduction to Islamic art and will be organized chronologically and regionally. It includes architectural elements, books and manuscripts, ceramics, glass, jewelry, metalwork, clothing, paintings, sculpture, and rugs and other textiles. And the Museum of Fine Arts Boston has been collecting Islamic art for about 130 years, but this exhibition marks the first time that the objects have been comprehensively studied, restored, and presented to the public, and we're honored to be the first exhibition venue for Ink, Silk, and Gold. So you may ask yourself, why Ink, Silk, and Gold? Works of art, such as a brightly colored coat or a handmade book, are among the most tangible manifestations of Islamic culture. Because objects like these are most meaningful when put to use, exploring Islamic art requires considering what it might feel like to wear the coat or stamp the manuscript with a seal of ownership. The exhibition explores how the material out of which objects in Ink, Silk, and Gold were made offers a window into what it might have meant to create or use it, bringing to light some of their most potent features. And so I'll call your attention to this beautiful silk velvet ikat coat. And while it's a wonderful object covered in this fantastic kind of stylized geometric motif, how much more meaningful is it when we know that a coat like this would have been part of a bride's dowry? She would have worn it on her wedding day, and then she would have worn it again at other important ceremonial functions throughout her life, and finally, at her funeral, it would have been placed over her bier. Islam is a major world religion practiced by more than 1.5 billion followers around the world. It arose in Arabia in the 7th century AD during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad founded the first Islamic state in Medina, and by the time he died in 632, Muslim territory encompassed 2/3 of Arabia, growing quickly beyond these borders. And at times, like I had said before, the Islamic state has stretched from North Africa all the way to South Asia. The first centuries of Islamic art were a time of great political shifts and of the gradual coalescence of an artistic tradition unique to these societies. When the Muslim state emerged in the 7th century, it conquered lands that had once belonged to the Byzantine and Sasanian empires and absorbed their highly sophisticated cultures. These were perpetuated and transformed in the development of a unique art form. And one of the most distinctive types of art object in this early period was the illuminated Quran manuscript. Issam is going to tell us a lot more about illuminated Qurans and calligraphy, but I'll just call attention to this beautiful gold Kufic script on an indigo background, and you can imagine this shining in the lamplight or the candlelight of a mosque and how it must have glittered. And this unification between the words, which are, again, about kind of illuminating the world in the light of God, its stylistic form, and the object before us all really merged together beautifully in Islamic art. In the 11th through the 15th century, lands on the periphery of the Islamic world began to break off into separate kingdoms. And with them, strong regional traditions began to define Islamic art, even while common elements persisted. North Africa was among the earliest regions to become independent. And these objects on the screen before you were produced under the Mamluk Sultanate, a powerful empire that encompassed Egypt, the Levant, and Western Arabia, and lasted from 1250 to 1517. On your left, you'll see an object that was part of a sacred context. It has been modified over the years, but it's made of woodwork from the 15th century. So it's beautiful ebony and Aleppo pine inlaid with ivory in this wonderful star pattern. And the frame of it was the door to a minbar, which is an elevated pulpit. So again, part of the sacred furnishings of a mosque. The object on our right is a beautiful inlaid brass and silver candlestick. And we don't know exactly what the context of this object was. But I do want to point out that it's easy to assume or to make the assumption that objects that are considered Islamic art are related to the faith of Islam, when in fact many secular objects are included in this exhibition. And most likely this candlestick is such an example. We then move to the Islamic world in Spain, southern Italy, and North Africa. I'll call attention to these two beautiful objects, which both come from the Islamic Caliphate at Cordoba. So this is the home of the Alhambra. On the left, we have a very fine silk textile, so the silk in the name, and it's emblazoned with lions and harpies. And just here, there's a curious inscription in Arabic. So this silk was made in Spain, but it's inscribed in a way that says, "Made in the town of Baghdad, may God guard it." Why would there be such a curious occurrence here? The answer is a sort of medieval marketing, if you will. So the silks of Baghdad were very famous, so the weavers in Spain, though they were just as accomplished, used some of the kind of renown of Baghdad to market their textiles. And this particular piece of silk was actually, in another cross-cultural moment of exchange, part of the shroud of a Christian saint, San Pedro de Osma, and it was found buried with him. Finally, in this 11th to 15th century period, we move to the eastern edge of the Islamic world, where groups of Central Asians began to move ever further westward and claim territory, first the Seljuks, and then later the Mongols and Timurids. And they established urban centers in which Islamic culture flourished. You'll notice that these are the first objects in my presentation to include figural imagery. It's a common misconception that representations of the human figure are banned by Islam. In fact, the Quran does not prohibit the creation of figural art, but it does warn very sharply about the dangers of idolatry, probably in response to the statues of gods that were worshipped in pre-Islamic Arabia. So while the Quran doesn't outright ban the creation of recognizable images, it does discourage it. So it's unlikely to find images of the human figure on objects made for religious contexts. But for secular works, like these two objects, it's very common indeed. And here we see imagery from the great Persian national epic, the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings. And this motif is on a glazed star tile. It is a fragment, but it's also one of the earliest representations of the Shahnameh. And then in this wonderful illuminated, illustrated manuscript that's known as the Great Mongol Shahnameh. And I'll just call your attention to some of the iconography here. So we have one of the heroes of the Shahnameh, Rustam, who is a legendary hero, sort of like Hercules. He and his brother have been killed by a traitorous personage, and all of Iran is mourning their death. And in the funeral procession, even Rustam's great horse, Raksha, has been included. So this is Raksha the horse strapped over an elephant's back. And Raksha and Rustam had many adventures throughout the Shahnameh. Three great empires ruled most of the Islamic world from the 16th to the 18th century: the Ottomans in Anatolia, the Mughals of the Indian subcontinent, and the Safavids of Persia. Though they were sometimes in conflict, they also had many similarities culturally, religiously, and in their forms of government, and diplomatic relations between the different empires. Here are two beautiful objects from the Ottoman Empire. We have a tile lunette and a piece of velvet, silk velvet. Both are decorated with a rich vocabulary of floral designs that were invented in the Ottoman workshops in 16th century Turkey. These floral and vegetal patterns, along with geometric and calligraphic designs, offered Ottoman artisans a means of decoration that avoided using human or animal figures. The next empire that we'll look at very briefly, and there are many beautiful objects in the exhibition, are the Safavids of Iran. And the Safavid Empire were really the Ottomans' chief rivals in this period. They had many territorial disputes over the area that is today Iraq, and they were anxious to control the silk trades. These are two objects from the ateliers of the Safavid Empire. One is there on the left, a beautiful miniature painting of a prince. He's very elegantly dressed. And this would have been part of an album that contained poetry and other works of art that would have been enjoyed by a kind of princely collector. And the last of our three empires is the Mughal dynasty. In South Asia, the Mughal Empire included at its height nearly all of present-day India, as well as Bangladesh and Pakistan. And the empire lasted from 1526 to 1858. This is a page from one of the most impressive manuscript projects in history. It was commissioned by the 13-year-old Emperor Akbar when he took the throne in 1556, ushering in a golden age for the Mughal Empire. It's a project that had 1,400 folios, each over 2 feet high. And you'll see in the galleries when you go to look that this is much larger than the other miniature paintings that you can look at. The project was begun in 1557 and took 15 years to complete. It is part of an epic saga called the Hamza Nama, which recounts the fantastic and fictional deeds of Amir Hamza, the paternal uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. Here, Hamza's newborn son, Dorab, is floating in a river, and he is the only escape from a shipwreck, and a humble fisherman is coming out to save him. Now, the text doesn't mention anything about exotic sea creatures or all the beautiful plants and activity that surrounds the scene, but the artists have taken license and have embellished it to make it a truly spectacular object. The exhibition concludes with a look at the 19th century and beyond. So there's been a tendency sometimes to pretend like Islamic art ended at the end of the the beginning of the 19th century. And that's partially because Western influences began to creep in, and it was easier to look at these cultures as something from the distant past instead of the vibrant societies that flourish into the present. And the exhibition includes this really important section to just demonstrate some of the variety of materials and mediums and how Islamic artists today are responding to contemporary art. Again, I do hope you'll go and see it, as my introduction can in no way do justice to it. So with that, we'll move on to our panel discussion. And we've decided to just format this as a series of questions. And Dan and Issam will be sharing their expertise so that we can learn more about early Islamic societies. So Dan, given all the diversity of form, content, medium in this exhibition, what might be a good way of thinking about it all together?
Great. Thank you. Before I begin, let me just thank Megan and everyone at the Frist, as well as Gail and Chandra for the opportunity to speak with you, and thank all of you for being here. It's great to see this many people out to talk about this exhibition. And I'll just, before I answer the question, I'll say that part of my job here is to give you some conceptual ideas that you can use when you're going through the exhibit to think about what's happening in the history of those pieces. And so the first concept I'll introduce here that I'll focus on is this idea of Islamic civilization. And so this is the answer to the question. This is one way to think about the diversity as well as some of the common threads in the exhibition. This term was introduced by a world historian. His name is Marshall Hodgkins. And what Hodgson was trying to do was overcome a couple of problems. The first one was a sort of historical theoretical problem, which was how to understand Islam as an historical phenomenon, a world historical phenomenon. The second one was a problem of terminology. And that problem was how does Islamic, when we use the term Islamic, does that refer to the religion of Islam? Or does it refer to Islamic societies and cultures that are heavily influenced by that religion but can't be reduced to it, right? And so you can think about this problem as in terms of how we use phrases like Islamic law versus Islamic art. I think most of the time when we use the term Islamic law, we're thinking of something that's more closely tied to religion. We think of that as religious law, I think, generally. Whereas Islamic art, as Megan was just showing, we often have a much broader idea of what falls into that category. And so this was sort of the terminological problem he was trying to overcome. And to deal with this problem, he introduced this term Islamicate to refer to the historical complex of cultures and societies in which Islam is the dominant tradition, but again, these societies can't be reduced to Islam. And so there's a fundamental tension in the category, and which is what makes it work. Okay, so on one hand, Islamicate civilization or Islamicate civilizations, depending on whether you add that S, it's an integrated whole. right? So Hodgkin says that a Muslim living in one part of this realm could go to another part of that realm and in some ways feel very much at home. There would be institutional similarities, there would be things that he or she would recognize. On the other hand, these societies are very diverse. And there's a wide variety of cultures and societies within this broader whole that we might think of as Islamicate. And it also changes over time. And so the flip side to that is Hodgkin also said that that same Muslim who traveled from one part of this realm to the other might be horribly homesick and feel very disoriented when he or she was in this other place, right? And this is the tension that sort of drives this category, that it's both an integrated whole, but also there's a wide variety and extreme diversity within it. A few other points that I'll just draw attention to here that I think are important for thinking about the collections is that this Islamicate civilization and or civilizations includes both Muslims and non-Muslims. So Hodgkin would argue you could think of someone like the Rabbi Maimonides, who lived in Islamicate Spain and North Africa as part of this Islamicate milieu, as part of an Islamicate culture, right? It also includes both things that we might think of as secular and as well as religious elements, and even things that at first glance might appear to go against Islam as religion, right? So something like drinking songs, secular wine songs, you could be incorporated into the notion of an Islamic culture and Islamic society to the extent that it was part of one of these societies. But again, it's the key here is that it's not Islam as religion, but part of the broader whole. Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about how this world of Islamic cultures came into being?
Great. Okay, so I'm going to offer a very brief, in answer to this question, and broadly brushed history of early Islam. And I'm going to skip over a lot of details. What I'm shooting for here is more of a conceptual history, again, to try to bring out some key contexts and key ideas. And I'll start with the period of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad lived in Mecca. How do I get the thing up here? There we go. So right there. Around the turn of the 7th century of the Common Era. And Islamic tradition has it that at the age of 40, he heard a voice believed by Muslims to be the voice of the angel Gabriel, which commanded him to recite. There here's Iqra, recite. And what Muhammad was commanded to recite were verses of what would become the Quran. And over the next 2 decades, he would continue to receive these verses, and eventually they would be compiled into what we now know as the Quran. I'm going to leave a discussion of some of the details of the Quran and its history, as well as its later iterations, to my colleague Issam, who's going to be talking about some of the pieces specifically from the collection, and move on to a sort of political and social history of the early Islamic community as a way to get us thinking about sort of the roots and the foundations of Islamic civilizations. So Muhammad lived in Mecca at a time that, at the time he first began to hear the Quran, and he was part of a tribe called the Quraysh, who had a strong hand in governing Mecca and its yearly pilgrimage. And once he started to receive this message, there arose some tensions between he and other members of his family and the powers to be in Mecca. Part of this had to do with the radical monotheism of his developing message, and in any case, over time, this put him at odds with some of the more powerful members of the Quraysh. So in 622, and this is a key event, this sort of community that's developing around him, they moved to Medina. So there's Mecca, and then Medina is here. 622. And this event is known as the Hijrah. It's the first year of the Islamic calendar, so it is seen as foundational. And in Medina, Muhammad is able to form a new community. There are already people living there, and they sort of invite him in his community and he becomes an arbiter of local conflict, and in many ways the political leader of this fledgling community. There's something that is known as the Charter of Medina. This is it evolves over time. It's a collection of sort of agreements as to how this community is going to run. And we can think of this, and some people think of this as the sort of the earliest expression of what is a nascent Islamic polity, Islamic political entity. A few important points here is that this political community, it's not religiously homogeneous. It includes Jews and Christians, as well as non-Jews and Christians. And so you can already see one of the hallmarks of Islamic civilization developing here, which is that it's not limited to just Muslims. Over the next 8 years, this fledgling Medinan community engages in a series of skirmishes and conflicts with its Meccan adversaries. And again, here I'm compressing a lot of history for the sake of time, but to make a long story short, in 630, Muhammad is able to return to Mecca, so back from Medina to Mecca. He marches on Mecca, and without, in this instance, there are negotiations, there isn't an actual conflict, and he and his community are able to enter Mecca and take it. And at that point, most of the rest of the Quraysh, his tribe, and their allies convert to Islam and align themselves with this nascent Medinan community. Okay, now that brings us to sort of the early expansion of this political community. What kind of situation does this early community find itself in when they take Mecca? So the first point here is that none of this is occurring in a political vacuum, right? So you can see here that you have the Byzantine Empire over here and the Sassanids here, right? Just before the time of Muhammad, there was and still was a sort of an Abyssinian empire here, and they had extended into the peninsula as well. So you can see that this is the Arabian Peninsula is in the center of a lot of kind of conflicting, certainly rival empires, and that in the period of Muhammad and the period just before that, the Arabs of the peninsula had both been at times used as proxies by these various empires, but also had also sort of invited these empires in on their behalf to intervene in their own politics, right? So all of this is not happening in a political vacuum. The second point is that what's developing is a sort of nascent state, right? A state apparatus is beginning to develop with Muhammad as its head. And so when this early community comes back to Mecca, there sort of is a question of, well, what's going to happen next? How are they going to fit into this political context? And what ends up happening is that over the next 120 years, this sort of fledgling state and fledgling community develops into a full state apparatus and engages in wars with its imperial neighbors and expands, creating an empire in the process, While this is going on, there's a lot of uncertainty within the Islamic community, and at times political strife, especially after the death of Muhammad in 632. And one of the major issues is who is going to lead this new state. Again, these are details that I'm going to skip over in the interest of time and to get to our more direct purposes here. But I'll quickly note that, for instance, the distinction between Sunnis and Shi'is, which is probably one of the distinctions that most of us here at least have heard about, can in some ways be traced to this period. And I'll leave that at that. So for the next 120 years or so, there's this expansion, and so by 750, the lands that are in green here, and this is what Hodgkins, who's again the guy who, the one who would put forward the idea of Islamic civilization, he thinks of this as sort of the core lands of Islamic civilization. So the region from the Nile to the Oxus River over here. After Muhammad's death, these expansions and then that state are led by a group of Muhammad's associates, and then eventually that gives way to a series of dynasties, political dynasties, first in Damascus, and then in Baghdad. Where did Baghdad go? Over here. This early state is known as the Caliphate, and the leader of that state is the Caliph. Okay, now Hodgkins argues that at this point, the civilization that he would name Islamic was just on the cusp of developing, that we're not really there yet, but it's just on the cusp of developing. But that said, one can already see several of the characteristics of that civilization developing in this period. So most of the, or at least a lot of the population of the early caliphate is not, it's not Muslim, right? So in that expansion, they're not wars of conversion, and eventually people in those lands, especially, let me go back, especially over here in what was the Sassanid Empire, eventually many of those people would convert to Islam. But in this period, in this early period, it's not happening en masse. And so what you have is a development of an elite Arabic-speaking Muslim class, but then also locals who are not Muslim, who are not Arabic-speaking. And so this tension is already, there's already apparent tension. This introduced Arabic and Arabic art forms like calligraphy throughout the region, and these traditions become one of the core common threads that run through later Islamic civilization. At the same time, these forms and traditions begin to interact with these local cultures and artistic forms. And Issam will be talking about this a bit as well. And then I'll close by noting that, I mean, there also was pushback against this on occasion, right? So by the 9th and 10th centuries, so after this caliphate has been established, for example, there's a movement in what is today Iran, again, that region that was part of the Sasanian Empire, known as the Shuhubiyya. And this is a movement of non-Arab Muslims that champion the literature and cultural forms of non-Arabs vis-a-vis a preserved Arab dominance, right? So again, the main idea here being this tension between sort of threads that run throughout, but then local contexts incorporating those threads, pushing back against them, doing things with them. And so you can see how by the time the early Islamic State was consolidated, the makings of an Islamic civilization made up of diverse local populations and cultures, yet linked to these common threads, was beginning to take root. So.
Thank you very much, Dan, for introducing us to the kind of complicated political and cultural and seismic shifts that are really happening in this period. So Issam, I wondered, can you use some of the objects in the exhibition to illustrate this development of an Islamic culture?
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Megan and Chandra and Frist Center, and also Vanderbilt University to give me this great opportunity to be here and with this great audience. So I like in this maybe 10 or 15 minutes to speak about 2 points. The first point about the trajectory or evolution of the writing system and calligraphy of Arabic scripts. So in this manuscript, what it's called Blue Quran. So we can see here this very early in Abbasid era. We can see 2 things. The first thing about writing system. So here what we called Kufic script. Kufic script, and maybe this is the oldest script or the oldest calligraphy. The oldest calligraphy features rigid and strict angular style of calligraphy, and you can see here square letters like here and here. So all of these letters, so in this Kufic styles, mostly refer to 17 letters. 17 letters then, after maybe 2 centuries, raised to be around 28 letters. So all of them 28 letters, but the idea about dots and vowels. But in these manuscripts, you can see only 17 letters. So in this manuscript, we can see 2 things, about colors and about calligraphy. So about calligraphy only you can see angular style. no cursive, and about colors you can see only two colors, blue and gold. So blue, the background, and gold about the letters gold. And also about something about Kufic, about the angular style. So here in the Kufic, you can see, if you know or if you are familiar of like Hebrew or Syriac or Nabateans or Aramic languages. So you can see here some symbols or some letters of Hebrew here. So like this. So this like noon or n or non in Hebrew. So that's not like in Arabic. So in Arabic, as I'll maybe show you in like maybe after 2 centuries, like in manuscripts, noon or n in Arabic manuscripts will be different. So this like in Hebrew, and also like different like kaf or k in English, like here in Syriac, different what we can see in other manuscripts after 2 centuries. So like here in the first like 2 centuries or 3 centuries, we can see like what I call like monochromatic or monochromatic approach, like two colors or one color in manuscript, and also angular style of Arabic system. However, also here, like after 2 centuries here, what we maybe in 13th century or 14th century, also this like Kufic script, but here we can see like different approach. This is different approach we call polychromatic. Polychromatic here, you can see letters in one color, but we have vowels and also dots with several colors. So these several colors like red, green, yellow, or blue reflects something, maybe symbols of paradise. And maybe the letters reflect only maybe black or blue. So we have a color, a specific color for letters and different colors for dots and vowels. And then this like very popular and very fixed, like to see like background in maybe in 14th century and so on, in cream background. So here you can see this cream background is like the most important feature for all Quranic manuscripts, and then the letters in black or dark brown or blue, mostly dark brown or black. Here. This also from 13th century, you can see here also polychromatic approach. Here you can see different colors and also cursive. This like not angular style of there's no angular style here, like multi or complicated calligraphy, and we call this an-nasakh. An-nasakh, this calligraphy. This calligraphy made or produced mostly by Ibn Muqla, a scholar of 10th century, who made a standard or standards of this calligraphy in the 10th century. And then so on, this calligraphy was an official calligraphy for Quranic manuscripts and like official correspondence and letters and messages between like leaders and so on. So here you can see specific colors for letters and several colors for dots and vowels. And also we can see also this like roundels and with like filled in with like specific colors here. And also we can see here like between two, like every verse we can see roundels, and with every 10 verse we can see like this big roundel. And this like in Mamluk era, this like very important features like to divide every 10 verses with this big roundels. Okay, so so we can back. I'm sorry. So only to summarize the calligraphy, so we can see like two phases. The first one, angular style, and then this angular style became cursive. And the angular style, the first angular style, called Kufic calligraphy. And then when this angular style became cursive style, we have a lot of calligraphies we name like محقق, نستعليق, diwani, ثلث, and others. So in the first one, this like you can see Kufic, and this one also Kufic, and this one we can see Nasakh, and also you can see some sulus here like cursive, like roundels, but what we have in our modern time, like all Quranic manuscripts and what we call like codex or mushaf, all Quranic manuscripts now, and like we have like nasakh, cursive style, not like Kufic. So that's all about manuscripts of Quran, about calligraphy.
I'm going a little bit off our script,
Sure.
but if you could tell our audience just a little bit about the importance of the Arabic language in Islamic cultures and why all of these diverse styles of calligraphy become such an important part of Islamic art
I'm
or
sorry.
Islamicate.
I'm sorry again.
Oh, just maybe if you could just tell our audience just a little bit about just the importance of the Arabic language in Islamic cultures and why all this attention has been lavished to develop these different types of calligraphic scripts.
So Arabic language, you can see, so Quran is very important for Arabic language. Without like Quranic or without Quran, there is no evolution for this like calligraphy, without any evolution for Quranic or for Arabic language. So all these calligraphies, all these like styles of Arabic language, all this like writing system, without Quran you couldn't see any evolution. So all this like Kufic, like the first one, like this one, before Islam, like there is like writing system before Islam in pre-Islamic peninsula. There are writing system like based on Nabateans and Syriac Aramaic. But after Islam, there are like a huge transition because of Quran, and this is a huge transition like from Kufic style, this angular, rigid and style, to make a lot of calligraphies, and till now there are many like flory calligraphy till now. This because of Quran, and that all of calligraphers, like famous calligraphers in the Islamic world, worked on Quranic manuscripts. And Quranic manuscript is the main documents and that calligraphers like worked on. And behind this there are like some poetries and some things maybe I'll speak about, not only this like objects, not only about like sacred text, not about like Quranic manuscripts. There are some objects like buildings and others, not only about Quranic manuscripts.
And that does bring us to our next point of So and you were just saying that we see some of these dynamics in manuscripts and other mediums. Could you tell us a little bit about other mediums where text plays an important role?
Yes.
Other way.
Other way.
There we go.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay. So here is like to speak about calligraphy or about Islamic art. So calligraphy, or not only beautifying, or Islamic art not only beautifying this text or this Arabic system. So we can see this like this calligraphy or this like letters on many objects, on buildings, poetry, and on like some like silk or on silk, as like Megan said or mentioned. But the most important, and here maybe the main point I'd like to mention in this presentation, on the mosque lamp, and this is something maybe is the most important about Islamic art. So mosque lamps, here we can see many issues like about Islamic art, about calligraphy, and about ink, about oil, and here you can see in this like exhibition, after this like talk, you can go to this exhibition and you can see what I'm talking about. So about mosque lamps, this is like a long transition. And before Islamic art, we can see oil lamp. Oil lamps is like lamps based on oil, and this oil should be like not oil like give light for 1 day or like 2 days, and should be oil like give light for maybe few days. And this is the idea. The oil is very important for light, not like for our days, modern time, electricity. So they are aware about like how the oil give lights for like how many days. And this is the idea about ink. So the ink and oil is very important about infinite and about like to make something like last for how many days. And we should think about the significance of ink. And ink will, in the history of Islam, is very important. And we can see in inscription of 16th century in some building, inkwell is like the water of human being. So inkwell is the water of human and the cause of his salvation. So that's very important. So the ink will just like, without ink, you couldn't write your memories. You should be saved with this ink. And that's why pen and ink and everything in all sacred text, in all religious Abrahamic faith are very important. You can see this like very important. And here I can mention this text especially from Quran. If all the trees on earth were pens, and all the seas with 7 more besides were ink, still God's word wouldn't run out. God is almighty and all-wise. So the idea of ink is very important for like to infinite. So that's why like all calligraphers in the Islamic history think about how to make or the production of ink, and to think about like to make ink gold or not to make gold. And the gold is very important here. And about this collection like silk, gold, and this like very important title. That's not, I think they are very smart to select this title. So gold here is very important, and how to make this ink, and how you make like your pen with reed or bamboo or anything. This is like very important, how you make your ink like last for, and then how we preserve this like collection in Nashville in our modern time, and like to make it portable like from place to place. Okay, so inkwell is very important. So now how artists shift this inkwell, or how they received the ink to make something like beautiful or beautifying something like different in mosque lamps. Ink to make oil. And here in this like verse of light, God is the light of the heavens and earth. His light is like this. There is niche. And in the lamp, inside a glass like a glittering star, fueled from a blessed olive tree. So blessed is very important, tree. From neither east nor east, no blessed, infinite, whose oil almost gives light even when no fire, light without fire. Infinite, the idea to give light without fire. like to last many days. Touch it, light upon light. God guides whoever he will to his light. So the idea to speak about infinite is very important in most lamps. So here, in this idea, we can speak about this mosque lamps. So in this mosque lamps is very beautiful. Here in this like the first mosque lamps that we received from Mamluk era, portable Mamluk object. In this like very standard on foot, you can see like put on foot, like you can do it in two places. Put based on foot, or you can suspend it from. There are 6 handles. Here you can see 6 handles. First, 2, second, and there are 2 behind. So can you think with me why 6 handles?
So it won't still. No.
6 days. 6 days, that's very important. About 6 days. And where's the 7th? What about the 7th? So the 7th here is a smoky, about heaven, about the rest, about Shabbat. This is like very important, about infinite, about like how you can make this like the encounter here about Islamic kids. This like in religious style, but this like how to make narrative in Mamluk era. This like how you, this like is very beautiful, like 6 handles and this like smoky and bubbled body. And then, and to think about the text here and text here. And the text or maybe what we have here between. So the text here, the God or Allah, the light of the heavens and earth only. And here you can see the world, the world, the world, the world, the world, the world. World, only world. Like our world. Okay, and here only heavens. And this you can see different styles of like here, sometimes this like our world, and here like another realm. Here our realm, and there another realm. And there is Shabbat, and here our work days, from Monday till Friday. And here Shabbat, here Sabbath, like to rest. And it's like very important to think about this in Islamic art, and how like Muslims receive this verse of light, and this sacred text, and how receive the oil from tree of olive, or the ink, to make infinite text, or to make infinite art. And then to think about different sacred texts in Judaism, especially about menorah, about Hanukkah, and about miracles, about the miracles that happened in the second temple. And how about this oil that's supposed like to burn one day and then lasted for 8 days? That's very important, the infinite, like how lasted for 8 days. This is the idea, light, that's the symbol of wise, the symbol of love, the symbol of being. And then to think about in Christianity, in the chapter of Matthew, in the God's kingdom, when like bridegroom came to the world, and then there are 10 bridesmaids waiting. And then 5 bridesmaids are foolish and 5 bridesmaids are wise. Okay? Bridesmaids who are foolish, they didn't bring extra oil. But the wise, they have extra oil. The idea of oil. The idea of oil, the idea of ink. So then the idea of infinite. So then how you can be infinite with ink, with oil? This is the idea of Islamic art. Thank you.
Thank you for that beautiful description. We only have a few more moments, but may I see the slide? Thank you so much. But I did wonder, I have one last question, and this one is for Dan. So we've talked a lot about the diversity of Islamic cultures as it can be seen in art. And can you tell us a little bit more about a particular society and its features? So we've been speaking generically, now we'll speak specifically. Oh, sorry, if you'll slide forward. There we go.
Okay, so Issam gets to have all the fun working with the objects and doing the exegesis, and now we're back to the sort of political and social history. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mamluk Egypt, but a roundabout way. I want to go back to where I left off, and then this will also give me a chance to just throw a few things out about the question of language in the Quran and Arabic. There's an important point kind of hanging out that I want to throw out. But if you remember, by 750, Hodgkins would argue that we're on the cusp of this Islamic society, right? That we're not quite there yet, but that we're there with the consolidation of the early Islamic state. So beginning about the mid-10th century, the political power of the caliphate of this state begins to wane. And what ends up happening is that the caliph remains symbolically important in a lot of periods, but doesn't command much political authority outside of its immediate surroundings in Baghdad. And what comes to take place is a sort of political fragmentation in which local rulers, often called emirs, control local regions. And they're often sort of seeking the symbolic approval of the caliph, but they're really sort of the political game in that area. Another major player here, and this is how we're getting to the Mamluks eventually, is so up here in this Eurasian steppe, around these seas, and then going all the way back towards Mongolia, you have large groups of nomadic people. Many of them, not all, but many of them who are speaking dialects of Turkish or Turkish languages. And over the next several centuries, after the caliphate sort of wanes in power, these groups are going to play really important roles in the political history of the region. On occasion, some groups of them would unite large swaths of this territory, and almost bring political unity to it again. But more importantly, these groups are playing important roles in sort of military and political affairs. And this is for several different reasons. The early caliphate had made it a policy to employ Turkish troops in their military. Some of these were mercenaries, others were slaves. And this pattern gets picked up by other leaders after that. One of the advantages of this policy is that it provides soldiers who had few local ties, and therefore their loyalty presumably would not be in question. Okay, so all of this is background to get us to Mamluk Egypt. Okay, so, and Mamluk Egypt would do, okay, so we'll be very quick here. Mamluk Egypt is one example of an Islamic society that features prominently in the exhibits here. Some of the pieces that Issam had showed you were from this place and period. Mamluk means slave or property, and it referred to some of these slave soldiers of the ruling family in 13th century Cairo. In the mid-13th century, some of these slave soldiers, however, overthrew the ruling Ayyubid dynasty, and they came to rule much of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. Until the early 16th century. And this pattern would be, or similar patterns would be repeated in other parts of the Islamic world as well, where you would have these kinds of slave soldiers coming into power. So I'll just be very quick. Don't need to do that. In any case, I'll just jump here because I've been told I have 3 minutes. We can think of the Mamluks as an Islamic society. Again, you see these themes of integrated singular civilization, so the importance of these Turkish slave soldiers throughout this realm, the importance of Islam, but it's also extremely diverse. It has its own cultural forms, its own political forms. And one thing I'm going to highlight here, in part because it goes back to this important question that you asked about the role of Arabic and the role of the Quran, is that in Mamluk Egypt was, in this period, much of this Islamic world was actually much more Persianate than it was Arabic. Persian had become the language of a lot of religious scholarship, especially mystical thought. It was also an important political language. Mamluk Egypt was a place where Arabic literature and calligraphy and various art forms continued to thrive, but it was one of the only places, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to draw attention to this, because I wanted to kind of relativize the discussion earlier, and also help you to think forward to the next part of this series, and as well as thinking about the collections as a whole. Because based on this presentation, you might walk away thinking Arabic is one of these threads that holds everything together, and in some ways it does, but it certainly is not the only Islamic language. It certainly is not the only language that would be a carrier of this kind of civilization. And then that gets us back to the central tension of this concept, right? Which is sort of continuity and diversity, and where is that continuity located, and where does it end, and how does that manifest in particular places and periods? So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if we have time for questions or.
I think we have actually exceeded our time in terms of questions, but I'm sure that everyone on the panel will be happy to talk with members of the audience here at the end. I'd like to thank Dan and Issam, both of you, for your contributions to today's talk. Dan, you've really helped us to get a sense again of this region and the development of these Islamic cultures. And Issam, that was a truly beautiful expression of how ink and oil and form and writing can all come together to make meaningful, truly meaningful works of art. I do hope you'll all visit the galleries today after our program, and I hope you'll join us in November when we'll be moving a little bit further into our story to that 11th to 15th century period. So again, thank you everyone for coming here today, and please do go and see these objects in our galleries. Goodbye.